The Cambodian Civil War. A complex conflict of ideologies, politics, and power. The Cambodian Civil War, which lasted from 1967 to 1975, was a multifaceted conflict deeply intertwined with the broader geopolitical struggles of the Cold War, regional dynamics in Southeast Asia, and Cambodia's internal political and social developments. The war culminated in the fall of Phnom Penh to the Khmer Rouge in April 1975, marking the beginning of one of the most brutal regimes in modern history. Understanding the Cambodian Civil War requires a deep dive into its causes, the key players involved, and the consequences that followed this tumultuous period. Cambodia, under the leadership of King Norodom Sihanouk, maintained a neutral stance during the early years of the Vietnam War. Sihanouk sought to navigate a delicate balance between the North Vietnamese communists, who used parts of Cambodia as a supply route via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the United States, which was engaged in military operations against communism in Southeast Asia. This delicate balancing act was challenging, as both external and internal pressures mounted. Internally, Cambodia faced significant unrest. The rural population, long neglected by the central government, grew increasingly resentful of the ruling elite in Phnom Penh. This unrest, coupled with the growing influence of communist ideology in neighboring Vietnam and China, contributed to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, a communist movement led by Pol Pot that sought to overthrow the Cambodian monarchy and establish a communist state. The Khmer Rouge capitalized on the dissatisfaction among peasants, presenting themselves as a revolutionary force against the perceived corruption and exploitation by the Phnom Penh elite. The Cambodian Civil War cannot be understood in isolation from the Vietnam War. As the conflict between North and South Vietnam escalated, Cambodia's strategic position became increasingly critical. The North Vietnamese used Cambodian territory to transport troops and supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, while the United States conducted secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia to disrupt these operations. The U.S. bombing campaign, known as Operation Menu, significantly destabilized Cambodia, killing thousands of civilians and further alienating the rural population from Sihanouk's government. In 1970, a coup led by General Lon Nol ousted Sihanouk, establishing a pro-US government in Phnom Penh. This coup marked a turning point in the Cambodian Civil War. Sihanouk, who had previously sought to maintain neutrality, allied himself with the Khmer Rouge and called for an armed struggle against the Lon Nol regime. The conflict quickly escalated as Lon Nol's forces, supported by the United States, battled the Khmer Rouge and their North Vietnamese allies. Several key players emerged during the Cambodian Civil War, each with their own motivations and interests. The Khmer Rouge, under the leadership of Pol Pot, was the primary communist force seeking to overthrow the Lon Nol government and establish a Maoist-style agrarian society. Their ideology was heavily influenced by Chinese communism, and they received support from both China and North Vietnam. The Lon Nol government, on the other hand, was backed by the United States, which saw Cambodia as a crucial front in the broader fight against communism in Southeast Asia. Lon Nol's regime, however, struggled to maintain control over the country. His military forces were poorly trained and equipped, and his government faced widespread corruption and inefficiency. As a result, the Lon Nol regime was heavily reliant on U.S. military aid and air support to combat the Khmer Rouge and North Vietnamese forces. Sihanouk, despite being ousted from power, remained a significant figure throughout the war. After his overthrow, he aligned himself with the Khmer Rouge, forming a government in exile known as the Royal Government of the National Union of Kampuchea, or GRUNC. Sihanouk's personal popularity, especially among rural Cambodians, helped legitimize the Khmer Rouge's cause and broaden their support base. However, Sihanouk's alliance with the Khmer Rouge was largely one of convenience, as their ideological goals were fundamentally different. Sihanouk sought to restore the Cambodian monarchy, while the Khmer Rouge aimed to dismantle all forms of traditional authority. By the early 1970s, the war had taken a devastating toll on Cambodia. The U.S. bombing campaign, combined with the ground fighting between Lon Nol's forces and the Khmer Rouge, had displaced millions of Cambodians and destroyed much of the country's infrastructure. Despite receiving significant military aid from the United States, the Lon Nol government was unable to stem the tide of the Khmer Rouge's advance. Corruption and incompetence plagued Lon Nol's administration, and his military forces were demoralized and increasingly ineffective. In 1973, the United States signed the Paris Peace Accords, ending its direct involvement in the Vietnam War. This development had a profound impact on the Cambodian Civil War, as the Lon Nol regime lost its primary source of military support. Without US air power and financial aid, Lon Nol's government was left vulnerable to the Khmer Rouge, who continued to receive backing from North Vietnam and China. By early 1975, the Khmer Rouge had surrounded Phnom Penh, and the city was under siege. Despite desperate pleas for help from Lon Nol, the United States, now preoccupied with its own withdrawal from Vietnam, was unwilling to intervene further. On April 17, 1975, Phnom Penh fell to the Khmer Rouge, marking the end of the Cambodian Civil War, and the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in Cambodian history. The victory of the Khmer Rouge in 1975 marked the beginning of a radical and brutal transformation of Cambodia. Pol Pot's regime, officially known as Democratic Kampuchea, sought to create a classless, agrarian society. The Khmer Rouge forcibly evacuated Phnom Penh and other cities, sending millions of Cambodians to work in rural communes. Intellectuals, professionals, and anyone associated with the former government were targeted for execution, leading to the deaths of an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people over the next 4 years. The Khmer Rouge's reign of terror, known as the Cambodian Genocide, decimated the country's population and infrastructure. The regime's extreme policies, including the abolition of money, the dismantling of schools and hospitals, and the execution of perceived enemies, left Cambodia in ruins. It was not until 1979, when Vietnam invaded Cambodia, and overthrew the Khmer Rouge, that the genocide came to an end. The Cambodian Civil War was a complex conflict shaped by internal divisions, regional dynamics, and global Cold War politics. The war not only devastated Cambodia, but also set the stage for one of the most horrific genocides in modern history. The fall of Phnom Penh to the Khmer Rouge in 1975 marked the end of the Civil War but the beginning of a nightmare for the Cambodian people. The legacy of the Cambodian Civil War continues to be felt today, as the country grapples with the scars left by decades of conflict, and the atrocities committed during the Khmer Rouge regime. The Naxalbari Uprising. The spark of India's Maoist revolution. The Naxalbari Uprising, which took place in 1967 in the small village of Naxalbari in West Bengal, India, marks a watershed moment in Indian history, especially in terms of political rebellion and peasant movements. This uprising led to the birth of the Naxalite movement, which has since evolved into a significant Maoist insurgency, influencing India's political landscape for decades. What began as a struggle for land rights among the rural poor escalated into a full-fledged revolution against the Indian state, driven by Marxist and Maoist ideologies. The backdrop of the Naxalbari uprising was a period of social and economic tension in India. Although the country had gained independence from British rule in 1947, it continued to grapple with stark disparities in land ownership, economic inequality, and widespread poverty. The rural population, particularly landless laborers and small farmers, were subjected to exploitation by landowners, further exacerbated by ineffective land reforms introduced by the Indian government. West Bengal, where Naxalbari is located, was one of the epicenters of this inequality. The agrarian system in Bengal was dominated by zamindars, landowners, while peasants, often heavily indebted, worked under oppressive conditions. These deep-rooted grievances made the region ripe for rebellion. Additionally, the communist movement in India, particularly the Communist Party of India, Marxist, or CPI-M, began to gain momentum among the disillusioned rural masses. By the 1960s, the Communist Party of India had already split into two factions due to ideological differences. Those favoring parliamentary democracy and those advocating for a revolutionary path based on Mao Zedong's principles. The CPI-M, formed in 1964 after breaking away from the CPI, became a vehicle for the more radical elements of the communist movement. However, within the CPI-M, another more extreme faction emerged, led by Charu Majumdar, Kunu Sanyal, and Jangal Santhal, who believed that violent revolution was the only way to bring about true social change. Inspired by Mao's success in China, these leaders advocated for an armed struggle to overthrow the existing political system in India, which they viewed as inherently capitalist and exploitative. They believed that the rural peasantry, particularly the landless and small farmers, should lead the revolution, using guerrilla warfare tactics to fight against the state. It was in this context that the Naxalbari uprising occurred, as the immediate expression of these ideological rifts and frustrations among the peasantry. The immediate trigger for the Naxalbari uprising was a dispute over land rights in the Darjeeling district of West Bengal. A sharecropper was attacked by landlords when he attempted to plough land that was rightfully his according to newly enacted land reforms. This event sparked widespread anger among the local peasants, who had long suffered from landowners' dominance. On May 25, 1967, the peasants of Naxalbari, led by Jangal Santhal and Kanu Sanyal, retaliated by launching an armed rebellion against the local landlords. What began as a localized revolt quickly gained national attention due to its ideological underpinnings. The CPI-M initially supported the uprising, but soon distanced itself as the revolt took on a more violent and radical character. Charu Majumdar, a key figure in the movement, saw the uprising as the beginning of a larger nationwide revolution. His writings, later known as the Historic Eight Documents, provided the ideological framework for the Naxalite movement, advocating for a Maoist-style protracted people's war. The government of West Bengal, led by the United Front at the time, responded with a combination of police force and military intervention. The uprising was swiftly suppressed, with over 100 peasants killed in the crackdown. However, the harsh response only fueled the revolutionary fervor of the Naxalite, who began to spread their movement to other parts of India, particularly Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, and Odisha. The Naxalite movement, as it came to be known, continued to grow in strength and numbers despite repeated efforts by the Indian government to suppress it. By the 1970s, the movement had evolved into a full-blown insurgency, with guerrilla groups carrying out attacks on government officials, police forces, and landlords. The Indian government declared the Naxalite a serious internal security threat, leading to further militarization of the conflict. At its core, the Naxalite movement was driven by the belief that the Indian state was irredeemably corrupt, and that only a violent overthrow of the system could bring about true social justice. The movement was heavily influenced by Maoist ideology, particularly the strategy of guerrilla warfare and the belief in a peasant-led revolution. Over the years, the Naxalite movement split into various factions, with some groups adhering to more orthodox Marxist-Leninist principles, while others adopted a more pragmatic approach. Despite these internal divisions, the movement continued to exert significant influence on Indian politics, particularly in rural areas where government control was weak. The Naxalite also played a role in shaping land reform policies in India. Their demand for land redistribution forced the government to take a more proactive stance on addressing rural poverty and inequality, although the success of these reforms has been mixed. The legacy of the Naxalbari uprising can be seen in the continued presence of Maoist insurgencies in India, particularly in the so-called Red Corridor that stretches across several states. The Naxalbari uprising had far-reaching consequences, both in terms of its immediate impact and its long-term legacy. In the short term, the uprising led to a wave of armed rebellions across India, as peasants and tribal groups took up arms against the state. This period of violence, often referred to as the Naxalite insurgency, continues to this day in various forms, particularly in states like Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. In the long term, the Naxalbari uprising highlighted the deep structural inequalities in Indian society, particularly in rural areas. It exposed the failure of the Indian state to address the grievances of the rural poor, and it forced the government to rethink its approach to land reform and rural development. While the Naxalite movement has often been associated with violence and extremism, it has also played a role in raising awareness of the plight of marginalized groups in India. Moreover, the movement has left an indelible mark on India's political landscape. Although the Naxalite have been marginalized in mainstream politics, their influence can still be felt in the form of leftist movements and parties that continue to champion the cause of the poor and oppressed. The Naxalbari uprising also served as a reminder of the potential for violent revolution in a country that prides itself on its democratic institutions. The Naxalbari uprising was more than just a local peasant rebellion. It was the spark that ignited a larger revolutionary movement that continues to shape India's political and social landscape. The movement, driven by Maoist ideology and fueled by deep-seated grievances over land rights and economic inequality, challenged the very foundations of the Indian state. While the immediate uprising was crushed, its legacy endures in the form of ongoing Maoist insurgencies and the broader struggle for social justice in India. The Naxalbari uprising serves as a reminder that the fight for equality and justice is often long and fraught with challenges, but it also highlights the resilience and determination of those who dare to challenge the status quo. As India continues to grapple with issues of poverty, inequality, and social unrest, the lessons of Naxalbari remain relevant today. The Six-Day War. A pivotal conflict in Middle Eastern history. The Six-Day War, fought between June 5 and June 10, 1967, remains one of the most significant conflicts in Middle Eastern history. Its brevity belied its long-lasting impacts on the geopolitical landscape of the region, reshaping borders, intensifying Arab-Israeli tensions, and setting the stage for future conflicts. Tensions leading to the Six-Day War were deeply rooted in the aftermath of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, and the establishment of the State of Israel. The Arab states, particularly Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, refused to recognize Israel's existence, and ongoing border skirmishes and raids exacerbated tensions. Several key events and developments in the early 1960s contributed to the mounting conflict. One of the primary causes was the growing friction between Israel and its neighbors over water rights. The diversion of the Jordan River's waters by Israel and its neighboring Arab states led to significant disputes, with both sides competing for control over this essential resource. Additionally, the rise of Pan-Arabism, spearheaded by Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser, played a major role. Nasser's vision of Arab unity and his anti-Israel rhetoric fueled hostility in the region. The situation intensified in May 1967 when Nasser ordered the withdrawal of the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, from the Sinai Peninsula, which had been stationed there since 1956 following the Suez Crisis. Nasser then closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, effectively blockading the Israeli port of Eilat. This act was considered an economic and military threat by Israel, which had long warned that such a blockade would be a cause for war. Furthermore, alliances among Arab states solidified, with Egypt signing defense pacts with Jordan and Iraq. This unified Arab front increased the pressure on Israel, which found itself encircled by hostile forces. Faced with an existential threat, Israel opted for a preemptive strike, setting the stage for the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War began on June 5, 1967, when Israel launched a surprise airstrike against Egypt's Air Force, known as Operation Focus. The attack was a devastating success, as the Israeli Air Force, the IAF, destroyed approximately 90% of Egypt's air power within hours, crippling Egypt's ability to defend itself from air raids. The destruction of Egyptian air assets was critical because it allowed Israel to achieve air superiority, a decisive factor in the war's outcome. Following the airstrike, Israeli ground forces quickly advanced into the Sinai Peninsula, engaging Egyptian forces in a series of rapid and highly coordinated maneuvers. By the end of the second day, Israeli forces had penetrated deep into Sinai, and by June 8, the entire peninsula was under Israeli control. On the Jordanian front, hostilities broke out when Jordanian artillery bombarded West Jerusalem and other areas of Israel. In response, Israeli forces launched an offensive that resulted in the capture of East Jerusalem, including the Old City, as well as the West Bank. The capture of East Jerusalem was particularly symbolic for Israel, as it reunited the city under Israeli control and allowed access to Jewish holy sites for the first time since 1948. In the north, Israel clashed with Syrian forces over the Golan Heights. Syrian artillery had long used the Golan's elevated terrain to shell Israeli settlements in the Galilee. On June 9 and 10, Israeli forces mounted a difficult but successful assault on the heavily fortified Syrian positions. By the end of the war, Israel had captured the Golan Heights, giving it a significant strategic advantage over Syria. The Six-Day War resulted in a decisive Israeli victory. In just 6 days, Israel had expanded its territory significantly, seizing the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel's territorial gains altered the map of the Middle East and gave Israel control over several areas with strategic importance. The war also had immediate and profound political and social consequences. For Israel, the victory solidified its military reputation and provided a sense of security through the acquisition of buffer zones. The capture of East Jerusalem, with its religious and historical significance, was seen as a major national achievement, particularly among Jewish Israelis. On the Arab side, the war was a devastating defeat. Egypt, Jordan, and Syria suffered heavy casualties and lost significant portions of their territories. The loss of Jerusalem and the West Bank was a particular blow to Jordan, while Egypt's defeat damaged Nasser's prestige and his vision of Pan-Arab unity. The defeat also fueled anger and resentment across the Arab world, leading to renewed calls for the destruction of Israel. The territorial changes resulting from the Six-Day War have had long-lasting effects on the Arab-Israeli conflict. The occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip brought a large Palestinian population under Israeli military control, creating a complex and ongoing issue of governance, security, and human rights. The war also marked the beginning of Israeli settlement activity in the occupied territories, which has been a major point of contention in peace negotiations ever since. The war also led to a significant shift in global diplomacy. In the immediate aftermath, the United Nations passed Resolution 242, which called for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the territories occupied during the war and the recognition of every state in the region's right to live in peace. However, differing interpretations of the resolution, particularly the phrase "land for peace," have made it difficult to implement in practice. In the broader context of the Cold War, the Six-Day War further entrenched the superpowers' involvement in the Middle East. The United States, which had largely remained neutral before the conflict, became a more active supporter of Israel, while the Soviet Union increased its support for the Arab states, especially Egypt and Syria. This superpower rivalry further complicated efforts to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict and contributed to the regional arms race. The legacy of the Six-Day War is still felt today. Israel's control over the West Bank and Gaza, as well as its annexation of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, remains a source of international dispute, and has fueled decades of violence and failed peace efforts. The Palestinian question, which had already been a central issue in the region, became even more urgent after the war, as hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced from their homes. Subsequent wars, including the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the Lebanon War, and the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, can all trace their roots back to the Six-Day War and the unresolved territorial and political issues it created. Additionally, the rise of Palestinian resistance movements, such as the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and later Hamas, can also be linked to the aftermath of the war. The Six-Day War was a transformative event in the Middle East, reshaping borders and altering the course of the Arab-Israeli conflict. While it was a swift and decisive victory for Israel, the war's consequences have been long-lasting and continue to influence the region's politics, security, and diplomacy. The territorial disputes and the issue of Palestinian statehood that emerged from the conflict remain central to the Middle East's ongoing struggles, underscoring the complexity and intractability of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Echoes of Biafra. The Nigerian Civil War. The Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War, was a brutal and devastating conflict that lasted from July 6, 1967, to January 15, 1970. It was fought between the government of Nigeria and the secessionist state of Biafra, primarily composed of the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria. The war was marked by intense ethnic rivalries, political tensions, and economic interests, resulting in the loss of millions of lives, widespread famine, and profound consequences for Nigeria and the broader African continent. The roots of the conflict, the key events that unfolded, and the lasting impacts on Nigeria are crucial to understanding the war's significance. The roots of the Nigerian Civil War can be traced back to the colonial era, where British rule exacerbated existing ethnic and regional divisions in Nigeria. Nigeria, a country with over 250 ethnic groups, was amalgamated by the British in 1914, but the regions, primarily the northern, eastern, and western regions, had distinct political, cultural, and religious identities. The Igbo people, concentrated in the eastern region, were more inclined towards Western education and economic modernization, which led to their dominance in the civil service and business sectors. However, the northern region, predominantly composed of Hausa Fulani Muslims, was less developed and harbored deep resentment toward the more economically advanced and politically dominant south. The independence of Nigeria in 1960 did little to heal these divisions. The political structure of Nigeria post-independence was a delicate balance of power sharing among the major ethnic groups, but it was fraught with tensions. The northern political elite, fearing marginalization by the more educated and economically powerful Southerners, often clashed with Southern politicians, especially those from the Igbo-dominated eastern region. This tension reached its peak with the 1966 military coups. The first coup, led by predominantly Igbo officers, resulted in the assassination of several northern leaders, fueling ethnic tensions. The counter-coup by northern officers in July 1966 led to widespread violence against the Igbo, with thousands killed in pogroms in northern Nigeria, prompting millions of Igbos to flee back to the east. The eastern region, under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu, declared its independence as the Republic of Biafra on May 30, 1967. This secession was driven by the desire to protect the Igbo people from further massacres and to assert political and economic autonomy, particularly over the oil-rich Niger Delta region. The Nigerian federal government, under General Yakubu Gowon, saw the secession as a direct threat to the unity of Nigeria and a challenge to its control over the country's natural resources. The refusal of the Nigerian government to recognize Biafra's independence ultimately set the stage for war. The Nigerian Civil War officially began on July 6, 1967, when Nigerian federal troops launched their first offensive to reclaim the secessionist territory of Biafra. Initially, Biafran forces had some military successes, including the capture of the Midwestern region in August 1967. However, the tide quickly turned against Biafra as the Nigerian federal forces, with superior numbers and better resources, launched a series of successful counter-offensive. By 1968, Biafra was effectively cut off from the outside world, and the Nigerian government imposed a naval blockade that led to widespread starvation in the region. Images of starving Biafran children shocked the world and brought international attention to the humanitarian crisis unfolding in the region. Despite the desperate conditions, Biafran forces, under Ojukwu's leadership, continued to resist. Biafra's struggle attracted some international sympathy, particularly from France, but most major powers, including the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, supported the Nigerian government due to economic and strategic interests, especially in Nigerian oil. The humanitarian disaster in Biafra led to the birth of modern humanitarian organizations. The International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and groups like Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, played pivotal roles in providing aid to the starving population, although they often faced significant obstacles due to the Nigerian government's blockade and restrictions. Despite Biafra's determined resistance, by 1969, the Nigerian military had gained the upper hand. Biafra was gradually reduced to a small enclave in the southeastern part of Nigeria. On January 15, 1970, Biafran forces officially surrendered to the Nigerian federal government, ending the war. General Ojukwu fled into exile, and General Philip Effiong, who took over leadership after Ojukwu's departure, formally signed the ceasefire. The Nigerian Civil War had devastating consequences. It is estimated that between 1 and 3 million people died, with the majority being civilians who perished from starvation and disease due to the blockade. The war left deep scars in Nigeria, particularly in the eastern region, where the destruction of infrastructure, homes, and lives was most severe. In the immediate aftermath of the war, General Gowon announced a policy of no victor, no vanquished, aimed at promoting reconciliation and national unity. However, despite efforts at reintegration, the Igbo people faced significant discrimination and marginalization in the post-war years. Many Igbos found it difficult to reclaim their properties, and the federal government implemented policies that effectively disenfranchised them economically, such as the indigenization policy that limited Igbo participation in key economic sectors. The war also had broader implications for Nigeria's political and economic landscape. The discovery and exploitation of oil in the Niger Delta became even more crucial to Nigeria's post-war recovery, leading to increased centralization of power in the federal government and the military. This centralization, however, created new tensions, particularly among minority groups in the Niger Delta, who felt that they were not benefiting from the oil wealth being extracted from their land. On the international stage, the Nigerian Civil War influenced the development of humanitarian intervention norms. The international response to the Biafran famine, although limited in scope, set a precedent for future humanitarian interventions. The war also highlighted the complex interplay between domestic conflicts and global Cold War politics, as both the Soviet Union and Western powers used the conflict to advance their strategic interests in Africa. The Nigerian Civil War remains one of the most significant events in the country's history, shaping its political, economic, and social trajectory for decades to come. The war highlighted the dangers of ethnic and regional divisions, and its legacy continues to influence Nigerian politics today. While Nigeria has made strides in reconciling its various ethnic groups, the scars of the war, particularly among the Igbo people, have not fully healed. Moreover, the centralization of power and the over-reliance on oil revenue, both of which were outcomes of the war, continue to pose challenges to Nigeria's political stability and economic development. The lessons of the Nigerian Civil War, particularly the importance of national unity, equitable resource distribution, and the need for inclusive governance, remain relevant not only for Nigeria but for all multi-ethnic nations facing similar challenges. Crossing the line. Israel's War of Attrition. The War of Attrition, a largely forgotten conflict in the shadow of more prominent wars in the Middle East, spanned from 1967 to 1970 between Egypt and Israel. Emerging as a direct result of the Six-Day War of June 1967, the War of Attrition was a prolonged conflict characterized by artillery exchanges, commando raids, and air battles across the Suez Canal. Both sides sought to wear each other down, in what became a protracted, low-intensity war with profound strategic and political consequences. The seeds of the War of Attrition were sown in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, in which Israel decisively defeated Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, seizing the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Golan Heights. The defeat humiliated Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser, whose vision of Arab unity and leadership was undermined by the rapid Israeli victory. Egypt's loss of the Sinai Peninsula and control over the Suez Canal was particularly devastating. Nasser, determined to restore Egypt's territorial integrity and prestige, was unwilling to accept the status quo of Israeli occupation. The United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 242 in November 1967, which called for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from occupied territories in exchange for peace. However, the ambiguity of the resolution's language, particularly regarding the extent of Israeli withdrawal, left both sides dissatisfied. Nasser, frustrated by the lack of progress in diplomatic negotiations and unwilling to engage in direct peace talks with Israel, chose a different strategy. A war of attrition aimed at eroding Israeli resolve and forcing a withdrawal from Sinai through sustained military pressure. The war officially began in July 1967, shortly after the ceasefire that ended the Six-Day War. In the early stages, Egypt engaged in sporadic artillery bombardments of Israeli positions along the Suez Canal. This phase was marked by limited engagements, with both sides testing each other's defenses and capabilities. Israeli forces had established a defensive line, known as the Bar-Lev Line, along the east bank of the canal. The Egyptians, meanwhile, sought to inflict damage on the Israeli forces stationed there, using long-range artillery and commando raids. One notable incident occurred in early September 1968, when Egyptian artillery bombardments killed 10 Israeli soldiers and wounded 18 more. These provocations gradually escalated into a broader confrontation, as Nasser sought to demonstrate Egypt's resolve to regain its lost territories. For Israel, these attacks were both a challenge to its hold over Sinai and a test of its ability to maintain its territorial acquisitions following the Six-Day War. By early 1969, the War of Attrition had escalated significantly, with both sides engaging in more frequent and intense artillery and air battles. In March 1969, Nasser declared the ceasefire between Egypt and Israel null and void, signaling a new phase in the conflict. Egyptian forces began launching massive artillery barrages on Israeli positions along the Bar-Lev Line, while Israeli forces responded with counterattacks, targeting Egyptian artillery positions, radar stations, and infrastructure along the west bank of the canal. Air superiority played a critical role in the war. Israel's Air Force, equipped with modern fighter jets such as the F-4 Phantom, carried out deep penetration raids into Egyptian territory, targeting military installations, including SAM missile sites and supply lines. These air raids inflicted significant damage on Egypt's infrastructure, but also drew the Soviet Union into the conflict, as Moscow sought to bolster its Arab ally. The Soviets supplied Egypt with advanced air defense systems, including SAM-2 and SAM-3 surface-to-air missile batteries, as well as advisors and military personnel. In response to the growing Soviet involvement, Israel intensified its air campaign, leading to one of the most significant confrontations of the war, the so-called War of the Plains. In July 1970, Israeli and Egyptian aircraft clashed in a series of dogfights, with both sides suffering losses. However, the introduction of Soviet pilots and fighter jets to Egypt's air force tipped the balance in favor of Egypt, forcing Israel to reassess its strategy. By mid-1970, both sides had suffered significant casualties and damage. Egypt's economy was strained by the prolonged conflict, while Israel faced mounting pressure from the United States and its own public to end the war. The growing risk of a direct confrontation between the superpowers, the United States supporting Israel and the Soviet Union backing Egypt, added a sense of urgency to the situation. The US, concerned about the potential for an escalation into a larger Cold War confrontation, stepped in to broker a ceasefire. On August 7, 1970, a ceasefire was finally agreed upon, with both sides pledging to halt hostilities and refrain from altering the military status quo within 50 kilometers of the Suez Canal. Despite the ceasefire, Egypt immediately violated the agreement by moving Soviet-supplied SAM batteries into the Canal Zone, strengthening its air defenses and setting the stage for the future Yom Kippur War in 1973. The war of attrition had profound consequences for both Egypt and Israel. For Egypt, the war provided a morale boost, as it had successfully challenged Israel's hold over the Sinai and inflicted significant damage on its forces. Nasser, though physically weakened by the conflict, he would die of a heart attack in September 1970, managed to restore a sense of Egyptian pride and resilience. However, the cost of the war, both in terms of human casualties and economic damage, was considerable. For Israel, the war exposed the vulnerabilities of maintaining control over occupied territories in the face of sustained military pressure. While Israel had successfully defended its positions and inflicted heavy losses on the Egyptian military, the war demonstrated that its strategic depth was limited, and that future conflicts with Egypt would require a different approach. The US involvement in brokering the ceasefire also underscored the growing influence of international diplomacy in the Arab-Israeli conflict, a trend that would continue in subsequent peace efforts. The war of attrition, though often overshadowed by the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, played a critical role in shaping the dynamics of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It was a war fought not for immediate territorial gains, but to erode the enemy's will and ability to fight. For Egypt, it was a necessary precursor to the Yom Kippur War, allowing it to rebuild its military capabilities and restore its confidence. For Israel, it was a sobering reminder of the challenges of holding on to occupied territories in the face of determined resistance. The conflict also highlighted the broader geopolitical stakes of the Cold War, as both the United States and the Soviet Union became increasingly involved in the region, supporting their respective allies. The war of attrition ultimately ended in a stalemate, but it set the stage for future negotiations and confrontations in the Middle East, leaving a lasting legacy on the region's political and military landscape. Death of an icon. The execution of Che Guevara. The capture and execution of Ernesto Che Guevara marked the culmination of the revolutionary's efforts to ignite global uprisings against imperialism and capitalism. After his key role in the Cuban Revolution, Guevara embarked on international campaigns to spread his revolutionary ideology, leading him to Bolivia, where his final days unfolded in 1967. The events surrounding his capture and subsequent execution have been widely scrutinized, becoming emblematic of Cold War-era political intrigue and the clash between revolutionary movements and established governments backed by powerful allies like the United States. Guevara's journey to Bolivia stemmed from his belief that the country could serve as a fertile ground for revolution, much like Cuba. After unsuccessful campaigns in Africa, particularly in the Congo, Guevara returned to Latin America with renewed focus. By the mid-1960s, he had quietly moved to Bolivia under a false identity, aiming to spearhead an armed struggle that would inspire broader revolutionary movements across South America. However, his campaign faced significant obstacles from the outset. Guevara struggled to establish relationships with local leaders and gain the support of the indigenous population, a critical factor in guerrilla warfare. His force, the Nankawazu guerrilla, was isolated, with communication channels cut off and supply lines disrupted. This isolation left Guevara's men vulnerable, unable to attract local recruits or access resources necessary for sustaining their efforts. The Bolivian army, with the support of the United States, was on high alert. Guevara's presence in the region was a cause for concern, not only for Bolivia, but also for US officials wary of communist expansion. The CIA provided crucial assistance, sending advisors such as Felix Rodriguez, a Cuban exile turned CIA operative, to assist in tracking and capturing the guerrilla leader. The decisive moment leading to Guevara's capture came on October 7, 1967, when a Bolivian informant alerted government forces to Guevara's location. The following morning, Bolivian soldiers, trained by US Special Forces, surrounded Guevara and his remaining fighters in a ravine near the village of La Higuera. During a skirmish, Guevara was wounded and subsequently captured. According to Bolivian Sergeant Bernardino Wanka, Guevara, unable to fire his weapon due to damage, surrendered with the now famous words, "Do not shoot. I am Che Guevara, and I am worth more to you alive than dead." This capture was a significant victory for the Bolivian military and their US backers. For Guevara, it marked the end of a years-long revolutionary mission that had seen successes in Cuba but faltered elsewhere. His capture was a significant blow to the global revolutionary movement, particularly in Latin America, where Guevara had hoped to ignite further uprisings. Despite being captured alive, Guevara's fate was sealed by Bolivian authorities, who, under the direction of President René Barrientos, ordered his execution. Barrientos, who feared that putting Guevara on trial or extraditing him to the United States might make him a martyr, opted for a swift and clandestine execution. On the morning of October 9, 1967, after spending a night in a dilapidated schoolhouse, Guevara was executed by Bolivian soldiers in the village of La Higuera. The execution was carried out by Sergeant Mario Terán, a Bolivian soldier, who fired multiple shots at Guevara, including fatal wounds to the chest. Guevara's final moments have been described as stoic, with the revolutionary reportedly saying to his executioner, "Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." Guevara's death was the culmination of a coordinated effort by the Bolivian military, supported by U.S. intelligence agencies, to eliminate the revolutionary threat he posed. Following his execution, Guevara's body was flown to Valle Grande, a nearby town, where it was displayed to the media as proof of his death. Photographs of Guevara's lifeless body, laid out on a concrete slab, were circulated globally, leading to a wave of reactions from his supporters and detractors alike. For many, these images transformed Guevara from a living revolutionary into a symbol of resistance. The decision not to bury Guevara immediately, but instead to amputate his hands for identification purposes, further emphasized the grim treatment of his remains. His body was later secretly buried in an unmarked grave, only to be discovered decades later, in 1997, when his remains were returned to Cuba and interred in a mausoleum in Santa Clara. In death, Guevara became a martyr for revolutionary movements worldwide. His image, particularly the famous photograph taken by Alberto Corda during a rally in Havana, became an iconic representation of rebellion, resistance, and anti-imperialism. While his military campaign in Bolivia ended in failure, his ideological legacy continued to inspire movements globally, from Latin American insurgencies to student protests in Europe and beyond. The events surrounding Guevara's capture and execution also highlight the broader geopolitical context of the Cold War. His death was a victory for anti-communist forces, particularly the United States, which sought to prevent the spread of revolutionary movements in its backyard. The CIA's involvement in the operation underscored the lengths to which the US would go to prevent the proliferation of socialist movements in Latin America. The capture and execution of Che Guevara in Bolivia marked the end of one of the 20th century's most iconic revolutionary figures. While his death symbolized the failure of his guerrilla campaign in Bolivia, it also transformed him into a global symbol of resistance against imperialism and capitalism. Guevara's legacy endures, not just as a historical figure but as an enduring emblem of revolutionary fervor. His image and ideas continue to inspire those who seek to challenge oppressive systems, ensuring that while his life was cut short, his influence remains alive in the hearts of many around the world. In the next chapter, we will cover the Tet Offensive, a major turning point in the Vietnam War, as well as Italy's years of lead, and the rise of Saddam Hussein in Iraq.